Okay, hi everyone, Steve here. So we're just going to talk this afternoon about the carbon cycle. And the carbon cycle is just one of those physical systems on the planet by which carbon moves from one place to another, or actually to be more technical about it, we could say from one store to another. Carbon stores are just a place where carbon exists for a certain length of time before moving on to a different store. So carbon is constantly being moved or recycled around where it is on the planet. And usually we can break that down into four main carbon stores. Sometimes you hear them called carbon sinks. So we're going to break it down into oceans, atmosphere, biosphere, and lithosphere. So you'll probably be familiar with oceans and atmosphere. The biosphere is really any living material, so plants and animals, ecosystems and so on the surface of the planet, whereas the lithosphere is the rock layer of the planet, and clearly most of the planet's surface or crust is rock layer. So we've got our diagram here, and I have already scribbled on it, but I thought, well, it's worth just leaving this so we can talk it through. So what we've got shown on the diagram, sort of simplified cross-section of the planet. Your textbook, I'm sure, will have a much more detailed, more artistic version of this type of diagram in there. And then what we've got the four stores, so atmosphere, biosphere, lithosphere, and oceans that are shown on there. Now, what I've also added on here are there's some numbers, which hopefully you can make out. And the numbers relate to the amount of carbon that exists in that particular store, what that looks like. And the unit of measurement for carbon in the carbon cycle, we normally will use petagrams of carbon. So over on here, it's usually abbreviated to large P, small g, large C, petagrams carbon. There's the spelling of petagrams. Petagram is really huge. It's equivalent to 1 billion tons. It's clearly a lot, isn't it? So 1 with 9 zeros on it, 1 billion tons, otherwise known as a gigaton. So we are talking about gigantic planet scale amounts of carbon that are being cycled through the atmosphere. And the other thing to think about with the carbon cycle, we're going to break it down into two different time scales, really, I suppose. We're looking at the geological part of the carbon cycle, which is really long-term timescales, and we're going to look at the biological part. We're not going to do all this now today, but we're going to also look at the biological carbon cycle, which is much more short term. So over here we've just got some terminology that we're going to use. We normally would refer to the carbon cycle as a biogeochemical process, really just to emphasize the fact that there is a biological and a geological element to it, and also it's a chemical process as well. Carbon is one of those elements of the periodic table, isn't it? So it's a crucial element for everything on the planet. The other terms that we've got here, a pathway is really just the movement it's making from one store to another. So from the atmosphere to the biosphere, we might call that a carbon pathway through the process that's going on. So the process that would take carbon from the atmosphere to the biosphere would be, what was that? Oh yes, that's right, photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is going to happen. Trees, plants, grass, whatever, as they grow, are going to be extracting CO2, carbon dioxide, from the atmosphere and using it as part of their life cycle and ability to grow. We shouldn't also forget that in the oceans we also have photosynthesizing organisms called phytoplankton, and these just exist in the surface layers of the ocean, but they're photosynthesizing. The oceans are huge, they're much bigger than the land surface is in terms of surface area, so the role of phytoplankton is very, very important to the functioning of the carbon cycle. Oh yeah, and the other word we haven't mentioned is flux, and flux is just another term to describe how carbon moves from one store to another. So we'll talk about petagrams and fluxes and things like that. Okay, so to get onto the numbers and where carbon actually exists on the planet, maybe we just start at the top of the diagram. In the atmosphere. So the atmosphere contains carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, which is also a greenhouse gas, and more on that in a future video. But yeah, 589 petagrams of carbon in the atmosphere. The carbon in the atmosphere, some of the carbon that's in the atmosphere now might have emerged, might have been pumped into the atmosphere 100 years ago, 150, 200 years ago, still circulating into the atmosphere, but over time it's going to be part of a flux that moves carbon from the atmosphere to other carbon stores. So we sort of mentioned the process of photosynthesis taking carbon from the atmosphere to the biosphere. Carbon would also move to the oceans from the atmosphere. Carbon can be dissolved in seawater. So there's about 700 petagrams of dissolved carbon in the sea. Actually, what the process is, there's a chemical process by which carbon dissolves in seawater. The more carbon in the atmosphere, the more carbon that is available to dissolve in the oceans. And what you get as a result of that is more acidic oceans, and that is one of the things that's happening at the moment. You have the formation of something called carbonic acid as the carbon dioxide dissolves in ocean water. But you've also got this process by which marine organisms like phytoplankton are photosynthesizing, taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, forming it as part of their growth process, and when that organism dies, that carbon is usually then becomes part of the ocean, or is going to sink to the bottom of the ocean and become part of the sedimentary layer at on the bed of the ocean. The other things that you've got happening in the carbon cycle, photosynthesis has grown all trees and things like that. When those trees die, there's another process that happens, which is part of the biological carbon cycle, and that is respiration, which is where carbon gets put back into the atmosphere. So one way that would happen is once one of those trees dies, carbon is going to be returned to the atmosphere as that tree decomposes, and some of it is also going to be added to the soil. So the soil is part of the biosphere, and the soil is also a carbon store. So about 1950 petagrams of carbon. So really important, actually, the soil as a carbon store. So every time we plough up a field or something like that, or change the land surface, we're disturbing the soil carbon store. Carbon will be released up into the atmosphere. So over time, sedimentary layers form, particularly as rivers might take sediment down to the ocean and take sediments with them. Over time, sediments are going to build up on the floor of the ocean, forming sedimentary rock. And actually, it's in sedimentary rock, part of the lithosphere, that we have by far the biggest amount of carbon. I don't know if you can see the numbers on there. I'm just going to tilt the camera so you can see it. So there we go. So about 83 million petagrams of carbon is locked up in the sedimentary rock layer. So by far the biggest amount anywhere in the carbon cycle is part of the lithosphere there. We've also got carbon locked away as fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are part of the lithosphere. Fossil fuels have been formed from organisms that maybe died hundreds of millions of years ago, and over time have gradually formed into what we now use as oil, gas and coal. So 1,471 petagrams of carbon are locked up in the lithosphere as by way of fossil fuels. Over here we've got volcanoes. So volcanoes are, once carbon's been locked away in the lithosphere, how is it going to get back up into the atmosphere? Well, one way that would happen is by volcanic eruptions, which are caused by tectonic activity. If you look at the number, they're relatively small compared to some of the other fluxes of carbon that we've got going on there. So it's about 0.1 petagrams of carbon is being released every year by way of volcanic eruption. So relatively small compared to some of the other things. When you consider that humans burning fossil fuels. Actually, we haven't got a diagram for that. So if you put on a little sort of factory or something, or power station, imagine that is putting fossil fuels, burning fossil fuels. We are then talking of somewhere in the region of 7.8 petagrams of carbon per year. So relatively speaking, volcanic eruptions pretty small, much bigger in terms of fossil fuel combustion. So humans, are part of the carbon cycle. We've been an increasingly important part of the carbon cycle over the last 200 years or so. And final part I was going to say something about was over here. So we've got the oceans over here. I'll come around that side. We've got the oceans over here. And the oceans are really important in helping regulate how the carbon cycle works. Relatively much more important than the atmosphere in terms of the amount of carbon that is stored in the oceans. So, and it does differ. So you can see the biggest amount of carbon stored in the oceans is in the deep ocean water, so just over 37,000 petagrams stored in the deep ocean. Some of it is dissolved, and that's going back to that idea of carbonic acid, how CO2 can dissolve in seawater, so around 700 petagrams there. We've got the biota, which is the marine organisms, which consist of about 3 petagrams of carbon, and then the surface layers of the oceans, we've got about 900 petagrams. So that is an important factor, because actually if the oceans weren't such a big store of carbon, where would all our carbon dioxide be that we've been pumping out over the last 200 years from fossil fuel combustion? Well, the chances are it would be up in the atmosphere. So we'd have an even higher concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere than we already have. So that brings us on to the final key term that we've got over here, which is parts per million, ppm, abbreviated as parts per million. And that's just a way of assessing the concentration of, in this case, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So at the moment, we're around 400. It's around 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, which most climate scientists feel is way too high. General consensus seems to be it should be around 350 parts per million to avoid any catastrophic climate change. But that's for another day. So anyway, that's our carbon cycle. There we go.